deploying, manipulating, and converting virtual machines. So we're going to take what we learned in the last nugget and we're going to expand it a little bit to talk about not only existing VMs, but also how to create new virtual machines inside of Workstation. Now, the cool part of virtual machines is their portability and the ability to move them around either over the network or put them onto a DVD or put them, send them to your friends and neighbors, maybe even transfer them around from server to server. And this portability is going to be important because when we get into ESX, we're going to talk about hot and cold migrations and how cold migrations work and the differences between cold migrations and hot migrations. And you'll need to understand whenever you're moving these files around what you need to move around. We'll also create a new virtual machine, and we'll talk about the process of creating a new virtual machine inside of Workstation. And then we're going to look deep into the VMX files and all the configurations and some of the configurations that we want to look at inside of that VMX file. Lastly, we're going to talk about a topic called P2V, which is the process of taking physical machines and turning them into virtual machines. VMware Workstation 6.0 has a brand new feature that allows you to do kind of a P2V process into VMware Workstation. This is really cool. ESX had a process, used to be called P2V, now it's called VMware Converter that you could do, but you could only get that with the enterprise version of ESX. If you have now a version of VMware Workstation, you can do sort of a light version of P2V, and we'll talk about how to do that and also other conversions that you may want to do in order to get machines moved from one location to the other or one format to the other. So let's go ahead and bring up our VMware environment once again. You'll see here we have this VM Nugget virtual machine that we created in the last nugget. I want to go ahead and actually close this and take it out of our inventory here and also remove it from our favorites because we're going to show the process of actually connecting in a new virtual machine. We double-clicked that file earlier to bring it into our VMware Workstation instance. One of the other things we can do here is click on File and Open and actually go back to the location. You'll see here this is the VMX file that Windows Server 2003 Standard Edition. We can actually go back in there and go through the file open process to actually bring that machine in any way. But that's not terribly interesting. What's interesting is how we can actually create the configuration associated with this VM Nugget virtual machine. And I want to talk a little bit about the portability associated with these virtual machines and how that portability makes them useful. Here's our VM Nugget, and here's all of the files that we talked about back in the last nugget associated with that virtual machine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this VMDK file, and I'm going to copy this VMDK file. It's about 2.5 gigs. I'm going to copy this VMDK file into a new location. So I'm going to do copy here, and I'm going to go back, and I'm going to say VM Nugget 2. We're going to go new folder, VM Nugget 2, and then I'm going to paste this file into this new location. So now what I'm doing is I'm copying this single file. We talked about the portability of virtual machines, and there's all these files associated with these virtual machines, but most of the files are actually unnecessary. The only file that's actually really necessary is the virtual machine disk file. If you think about it, right, with your servers, as long as you have the same physical server, you can take the disk drives out of the physical server and put them into an identical chassis, and it will boot up just fine. And so what we're essentially doing by copying this virtual disk file is we're virtually ripping the hard drives out of one server chassis and popping them into another and lighting up that second server. Now when we do this, we can't actually just double click the VMX file because as you'll see here, there is no VMX file. We only have the disk file. We have to create a new VMX file. So let's go ahead and create that new VMX file and show how we can take an example VMDK file, an example machine. Maybe I threw it on a DVD and I handed it to my buddy and I said, here you go, buddy. Hey, go ahead and boot this thing and have at it. Let's show how we can create that VMX file inside of the interface. So I'm going to go ahead and come back to here, and I'm going to create a new instance, a new virtual machine now, and I'm going to call it VM Nugget 2. So I click Next, and we want to choose Custom so we can see all the options associated here with creating a new virtual machine. I click Next, and I choose what sort of hardware compatibility. We showed this in the last nugget. Is it Workstation 6, 5, or 4? We want to use Workstation 6 to make it compatible with the Workstation and get all the nice fun features associated with Workstation 6. If I click Next now, I have to choose an operating system associated with this virtual machine. This is a Microsoft Windows Server 2003 Standard Edition operating system. So there's our version right here. This tells the VMX file to do those certain parameters so that it's optimized for Server 2003 Standard Edition. The next thing is to give it a name, and I'm going to call it VM Nugget 2. And I'm going to give it a location 2, and you'll see here that it has pre-populated the name of the virtual machine with this VM Nugget 2. Now the location where I want to put this is not inside of Documents, but is actually on the desktop in this ESX virtual machines location. There's that VM Nugget 2 location. I want to make sure that I create that VMX file and all the other files in the same location as the VMDK file. I don't have to do that. But if I have half of the machine in one place and half of the machine in another place, it's going to get really complicated to try to figure out what is what. So I typically usually put all of the files associated with one virtual machine in a single folder so that I always know what it is, and then name the folder by the name of the machine. Click Next. It's going to give me an error message initially that says, wait a minute, you're trying to put all of this stuff in a place that appears to contain an existing virtual machine. I know that. I'm doing this because I want to make it easy on myself. So I can go ahead and click Yes here. Note, it is a bad idea to try to put 2 virtual machines in the same folder. That's two VMDK files, any of the files that we talked about earlier. Don't ever put them in the same folder. So I click Yes. I can choose 1 processor or 2. It doesn't really matter. I'll choose 1 because it currently exists with 1 processor. And now I can choose how much memory I want. Maybe for this virtual machine, I want to give it, instead of 1024, I want to get 1500, a gig and a half of RAM associated with it. You see here it moves the little bar over a little bit more. I can click Next again, and I can choose what type of network connection I want, bridged, network address translation, or host only. I'll choose bridged. And then do I want to give it an IDE or a SCSI adapter, or which type of SCSI adapter? One of the things that happens when I choose the operating system is it chooses which of the SCSI adapters is actually most appropriate for that operating system. In my case, the LSI Logic SCSI adapter is perfectly fine for the type of SCSI hard drive that is currently connected into that machine. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the LSI Logic. For the most part, you're going to want to choose the defaults. Click Next again, and I now have the option to either create a new virtual disk, use an existing virtual disk, or use the physical disk. We saw this in the last nugget. Now, if I create a new virtual disk, I'll get the parameters for how I want to create that virtual disk. Is it SCSI or IDE? What's the size? Do I want to allocate the disk now, etc.? But I'm not interested in doing that. I'm interested in using the VMDK file that I received from my buddy. So I'm going to click the little button here and say Use an existing virtual disk. It's already been pre-configured. I now have to go to the location where I believe that disk exists. It's here in this VM Nugget 2 location. You'll see there's my VMDK file that I've created. If I click Open, now we'll be using that VMDK file. If I click Finish, it says, oh, do I want to add this older version of a virtual disk in this virtual machine? It says the chosen virtual disk was created by an older version of VMware product. This particular VMDK file was actually created by Workstation 5.5. It is going to attempt to use 5.5 or be able to use this virtual disk without converting. Once I'm sure and happy that I know that I've got a successful virtual machine that I've copied, then I can scope this to VMware 6 using the process that we talked about in the last nugget. I now have created a successful virtual machine. So now I have VM Nugget 2 here. If I go back to my location here, you'll see I have a couple of files now. There's that VMSD file. There's the VMX file. If I want, I can even go back to VM Nugget and add VM Nugget into my interface as well. So I now have 2 tabs. Here's VM Nugget and VM Nugget 2. One thing that's very important now that I've created this file is I have an exact duplicate of the virtual machine that I created in the last nugget. Now, what's the problem with exact duplicates? If I create an exact duplicate, if I try to put it into a domain, it's going to have the same name. It's going to have the same SID. It's going to have all the same characteristics of the other machine. So for me to create this exact duplicate and to power on this exact duplicate, 2 things have to happen. Really 3 things have to happen. I can go ahead and click Yes here because I don't have a virtual device floppy 0. I'm really not interested in virtual device floppy 0. Once I power on this machine, if VM Nugget is actually powered on, I'm going to get an error message that says, wait a minute, the server name is duplicate on the network. I have 2 VM Nuggets. By changing the name here, I didn't actually change the name of the system inside of my virtual machine. I actually have to go back into my virtual machine. So the 3 things I have to do, 1 is take this machine out of the domain, 2 is change the name of the machine, and 3 is bring it back into the domain. There's one more item too that has to be completed, and that's to change the SID. In order to change the SID, I need to use a resitting tool like Ghostwalker or sysprep or sysinternal's new SID in order to change the SID of the machine. So I'm going to go ahead and click Control-Alt-Insert to launch into the machine. You'll see here now that I still have the old name of the computer because I haven't changed the name yet. And if I log in, I'm going to log in. This machine believes it to be VM Nugget. And right now, the domain actually believes it to be VM Nugget as well. So once the logon completes, I need to bring it out of the domain. It says it's found some new hardware. I'm not really interested in that right now. What I need to do is bring it out of the domain and then change the SID of the machine. Now, you've seen the process for bringing it out of the domain. There's no interest there in showing you how that process works. But what I have done is here on the C drive is created this new SID location. This is one of the many tools that you can do to re-SID a machine. This machine currently exists in a domain. If I click the new SID, it allows me to create a new random SID for this machine and then apply that random SID to the computer. I can also change the computer names too. Call it VM Nugget 2, for example. It is going to reboot the SID or reboot the machine after the SID is applied and complete the resitting and the renaming of the machine. Now, typically, I don't do this if the machine's in the domain. I usually bring it out of the domain first before I apply the new SID tool. But at least now it's only a 3-step process instead of a 4-step process to actually change the name in the domain, and reapply the SID to this machine. Now, I'm not particularly interested in doing this at this point, so I'm going to cancel out of this and close it down. And I'm really not interested in this VM Nugget 2, so I can power this machine off. Never show this hint again. Power it off. The machine is now completely powered down. If I wanted to delete the machine now, it's very simple for me to go back in here to VM Nugget 2 and actually choose to delete the computer. Let's say I'm not really interested in really getting rid of the machine. I'm not really interested in deleting the machine so much. What I'm interested in is creating the machine from scratch. Let me see here. I've still got VM Nugget 2 in there, and I've still got it in my favorites, so I can go ahead and remove that from my favorites and close down VMware Workstation. Now I can delete VM Nugget 2. But maybe I wanted to create a new VM Nugget 2. I'm not interested in copying VM Nugget, for example. I'm interested in creating one from scratch using the CD. You'll see here that I've copied, I brought out an ISO file that is the disk 1 of Windows Server 2003 R2 Standard Edition. That ISO file is 579 megs in size, and it is essentially the CD that you get with the gold coloring on the front, and allows you to boot a new or create a new Windows Server 2003 R2 edition. Let me go ahead and start up VMware Workstation again. And once I start it up, I'm going to, instead of connecting my VMware Workstation to an existing machine, I want to create a new machine from scratch. Let's go ahead and do that now. So we click File and New, create a new virtual machine, and we, just like we did before, we're going to create a custom machine. We click Next, we choose operability for Workstation 6, and Next, and again, we're going to choose Windows Server 2003 Standard Edition, just like we did before. All of these we've done before. I'm going to call it VM Nugget, let's call it VM Nugget 3 now, so we don't have it confused with our previous attempt, and we're going to put it on the desktop in that virtual machines location. And there we go, /VM Nugget 3. I click Next now, one processor. Maybe let's get crazy and make it a double processor system, dual processor system. And we're going to give it 1.5 gigs of RAM here, bridged networking, the LSI logic controller. But now we're actually going to create a new virtual disk. We're going to create that virtual disk of type SCSI in case we want to move it into ESX. And we're going to give it 8 gigabytes. We're not going to allocate all the disk space now because that takes a long time to do, and I don't really feel like waiting around for it. Click Next now, and then here's the disk file. There's our VMDK file. I can change this if I want to VM Nugget 3. I'm creating this file now, and I click Finish. So now I've created essentially an empty machine. If I go back here to VM Nugget 3, you'll see that my VMDK file is only about 1 megabyte in size. That's just the essentially the structures you need to create that VMDK file. What I need to do in order to build a new machine is actually connect my CD-ROM drive into that new machine. So if I click to edit the settings and I go to my CD-ROM drive, I'm currently using a physical drive. Instead, I want to boot to an ISO image. And on that ISO image, I want to connect it to my Windows Server 2003 R2 Standard Edition CD1 ISO file. There it is right there. I click OK, I open, and now I'm connecting in my CD-ROM drive to that ISO image. I click the checkbox here to connect it power on, I click OK, and now if I start the virtual machine and click inside of it as I start it, I'm going to actually connect into that CD-ROM drive and begin the process of building a new Windows Server machine. So you'll see here, here's the Windows setup, and I can go ahead and go through all the process I need to create myself a new machine. Now, virtualization is really, really cool, and it's really cool specifically because I don't know about you, but I've built enough of these Windows servers in my life, and personally, I'm getting really sick of watching this blue screen go through and complete all the processes involved with setting up a new Windows server. With virtualization, I no longer have to pay attention to this except when I get a new version of the operating system, like when Windows Server 2008 comes around. I need to create a new template file. My version, this VM Nugget here template file that I use personally, is the same template file that I've had forever and ever and ever. I just occasionally log into it and patch it so that it's up to date with the most up-to-date patches, and occasionally apply a service pack to it. And anytime I need it, I just copy and paste it around, and I don't have to go through this process of setup anymore. And I'll tell you what, for me, that's a great thing. Hopefully for you, not having to go through setup anymore is a great thing, because copying a virtual machine file takes, what did that take? About 2 minutes to copy that 2.5 gigabyte file. Doing a complete Server 2003 setup could take half a day if you're doing all the patching and everything. So this is the process I would use for actually creating a virtual machine from scratch. Now, throughout all of this, we keep talking about how all of our configurations modify this VMX file. And I'm going to go ahead and power off this virtual machine because I have some configurations inside that VMX file. We just haven't really looked at them yet. We're seeing the manifestation of those configurations here inside the interface. But what if we want to script some changes to VMX files? Maybe we want to be more command line junkies instead of GUI guys. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and you'll see here's our VM Nugget 3, and then here's our VMX file associated with it. And I'm going to open up this VMX file with Notepad instead of opening it up with Workstation itself. So I'm going to go see Windows System 32 Notepad. There's Notepad. And I'm going to open up this file with Notepad just this one time. And you'll see now that inside of this VMX file is human readable information associated with that virtual machine. We have our config version that's equal to 8, and the virtual hardware version equals 6, and the number of vCPUs, we have 2 vCPUs. We have a SCSI, LSI Logic SCSI drive that is present. Memory size is set to 1500. We also have a VMDK file that is present as well. We have an IDE disk that is set to the CD-ROM here, and we have a floppy drive. We keep getting that error message about the floppy drive, and the reason we keep getting the error message is because that floppy drive is currently locked for use by the other virtual machine. We have an Ethernet address that is present. It is currently not set for Wake on Packet Receive or Wake on LAN. We have a USB present and an EHCI present, and even sound card that's present. So all of these actually go into VMware Workstation to populate all those entries that we keep seeing inside of here. Now, what's interesting about the VMX file, and the reason why you need to know it, is because this VMX file is going to be relatively the same depending on which version of VMware you use, whether server or workstation or ESX. And also there are some configurations inside this VMX file that you may not necessarily have exposure to inside of the GUI. There are, in fact, as you get into some more advanced virtualization topics, you'll find that there are some components that we actually need to go into the VMX file to manipulate in order to provide functionality that's not available inside the GUI. One of these that we're actually going to do in a future Nugget allows us to build a full ESX server inside of a VMware workstation. So when we get into ESX, we're going to go back into this VMX file, and we're going to make a couple of changes to this VMX file to allow us to do some more things that are not necessarily available in the GUI. One of the things that you may want to do, if you really screwed up your naming, for example, you'll see here's that CD drive name, that ISO that we created. Here's the display name that shows inside the interface, and here's the NVRAM file that we've created. If you really screwed up your naming for any of the files in here, so you can go through and actually manipulate these names. And if you want to change it because you don't want all of your names, if all of your NVRAM names are Windows Server 2003 Standard Edition, you can change them around to make them a little more interesting, a little more user-friendly for you. Also, you can see down here, here's your UUID information, your UUID information for VMware, or the unique identifier for it. And also here is your MAC address for the network card that we currently have configured for this machine. You can actually go through, if you need to, and change the MAC address to a different MAC address. Now, why is this useful? Because if you have an existing machine with an existing MAC address and you want to test spoofing that machine, you can give it the same MAC address as an existing machine, and the network will assume that that is the other machine. Obviously, both machines can't be on at the same time, or the network gets really silly. But you can go into this VMX file to actually change around the MAC address information to spoof some information about where you want the network to route information to. So be aware of this VMX file. We're not going to talk about too many of the customizations because those you're not going to need them unless you recognize that you do. And you'll find them on VMware.com. If you go to the forums, there are a lot of people that have, oh, I need to figure out this problem, and there is a number of customizations associated with it. VMware does not really necessarily support directly manipulating these files with those customizations, but you can still do it. It's very easy. Just go in here and type it into there's no order necessarily to these. So these are the VMX files. The last topic that we need to talk about is the P2V process, and we're actually going to talk about kind of the P2V Lite process that comes with Workstation. We'll talk a little bit about P2V process in a little more detail later on in ESX, but for the Workstation process with Workstation 6.0, there's actually a new tool, this import tool, if you go into File, that allows you to do some pretty nifty manipulations of existing virtual machines. If I click on the Import tab, it's going to open up a wizard, and this wizard gives me the ability to convert or to import in machines from other locations. Now, let's say I have a Windows virtual server file that I want to convert. I can convert that Windows virtual server file from its format into VMware. Let's say I have an ESX file that I want to convert into Workstation. I can convert that ESX file into Workstation. Let's say I have a physical machine. Maybe I have a desktop that I want to convert into Workstation. I can do that as well. All of that is done inside of this import wizard. Now, it sounds like magic, and to be honest, it really is kind of magic in the way some of this stuff works, but the really honest truth of what this P2V process does is it really takes the hardware. It's sort of like a ghosting process. You ghost the machine into a VMDK file, and then you change the hardware around. So instead of having the individual video driver and network driver and sound driver and USB driver and all those drivers, instead you have the VMware version of those drivers. It's a two-step process. So we image the machine over using the VMware imaging tool, and then we change the drivers, and poof, you're done. So it seems like magic, and it does feel like magic, but in reality, it's really not all that difficult. So the first thing we need to do is choose a source for the input. And this may be this physical computer that we're running off of. We can actually P2V the actual physical machine we're on. We can do a remote physical computer as well. So if there's another computer on our network that we want to P2V, we can do it. We do not necessarily have to shut the machine down. In fact, we can't shut the machine down. The machine has to be powered on to do this. We can do a VMware virtual machine or a Microsoft virtual machine or even a third-party backup image if you've got a backup exec or another type of image that you want to convert, maybe a V2I image that you want to convert into a VMDK file. You can do all of these. I want to make very specific one very important thing about any time you're doing a P2V process, and that is that the P2V process needs to run on a functioning computer. But there's one thing that a computer may be doing that will not work very well if you try to do it, and that's if it's running a transactional database of any form. And that can be like a SQL database, an Exchange database, an Active Directory database. Any kind of transactional database is not what we call crash consistent. It does not arrive in the target destination crash consistent whenever you complete the process. And that is because the import process does not actually quiesce the database in order to move it over. It quiesces the machine or quiets the machine, but it does not quiesce the database. And so when I bring that machine over, it may not be in a consistent state. The database may not be in a consistent state. So before I choose the next button here, if I'm going to be doing any kind of other machine that has those transactional databases, I need to shut the services down, whether it's Exchange services or SQL services, or, well, you can't do it with Active Directory, but in 2008 you could do it with Active Directory by shutting down the Active Directory domain server service. So let me go ahead and click Next here. And I can choose if I want to use a physical computer, an ESX server, a virtual center virtual machine, or a standalone virtual machine. Let's say in either one of these options, I'm going to move from the source location, whether it's physical or logical, convert it and bring it into my workstation so I can run that machine as a logical workstation. Let's go ahead and show how we'll do that. So let's say that the machine that we want to actually bring into our VMware Workstation instance is a physical computer. When we do a physical computer, we actually need to install an agent onto that machine to actually allow that physical to virtual process complete. We'll go ahead and click Next here, and you'll see that I have a remote machine already identified, Nugget 1, and that machine is currently running. It's actually functioning right now. It's actually up and running, and I have the administrator username and password logged in. So what I'm going to do next, if I click Next, is actually connect to that machine and install a VMware P2V agent or converter agent onto that machine for the purposes of completing the conversion. I get an option here that do I want to uninstall the converter agent once the import succeeds, or do I want to manually uninstall the files later? In this case, I can choose to automatically uninstall the files. I want to do the conversion and then leave the machine alone as if it was never there before. If I'm using NT4 or Windows 2000 operating system, I may have to reboot that remote source machine in order to get that agent to work properly. If I click yes here, it's going to do the installation of the agent. This installation of the agent can take a couple of minutes, so I'm going to pause the recording while we wait for the agent to complete installing. Okay, and we're done. And now you'll see that once we have the agent installed on the remote machine, we can now see a little bit of information about that remote machine. It has a C drive, it's a disk 0, it's about 4 gigs in size. Most of that size is used. I can choose when I do the import to either maintain the size, I can give it the minimum size that's possible for it, or I can give it a new size. Maybe I want to change it to 8.0 gigabytes instead of 4.0. Looks like here that I'm just about out of space on that drive, so this gives me an option to add more disk space to it as I bring it in. Now, one thing I've done while we were paused is I actually term served to that machine. This is Nugget 1, the remote machine that we term served to. And when we installed the agent onto Nugget 1, you'll see that it's really difficult to see that anything is really changed on Nugget 1. If we click Start in here, you'll see there's no VMware information here. And but if I do go to Services now, you'll see that there's a VMware agent service that has been started on this machine. Also, if I go into my computer and then I go to the C drive and I go to Program Files and I go to VMware, I have this VMware converter agent that is now present on the machine as well. And here's all the binaries associated with that VMware converter agent. This is the executable code that will run the process of converting this machine once we actually start the conversion process. So this is Nugget 1, and this is the machine we're actually trying to convert at this point. If I click Next now, I can choose what kind of destination I want this machine, once converted, where I want it to go. If I click Next here, I can import this machine into a VMware standalone virtual machine or a VMware ESX server. Now, it's interesting to note that when Workstation provided this ability for us to move machines or P2V machines into Workstation, there is another version of Converter that allows you to convert things into ESX, but you got to pay for that. You have to actually pay for the Enterprise Edition of ESX in order to get that capabilities. So as long as you have Workstation Fusion, which is the Mac version of VMware, Server or Player, you can do all kinds of P2Ving, but if you want to go to ESX, you've got to have that Enterprise version in order to be able to do it. So we see down here a license is required to import a remote machine to an ESX server. I click Next here and I can give it a name. Maybe we'll call it Nugget 4 at this point, and give it a location. This location must be network mountable. It must be accessible to both the source machine and the destination machine. That's why it's got to be network mountable. I'm going to give a location that both the source and the destination machine need to be able to see. So in my case, I'm going to give this location, I'm going to give this a location which both the client and the server can see at the same time. All right, so I need to create a location that has some disk space on it. I don't have any Nugget machines that actually have disk space available, but I do have one here on the root of C that have available space on. So I click Next. It checks the availability of the destination, and then I get the option, just like before, do I want the virtual disk files to grow as they need to, or do I want to allocate all that disk space now? Now, normally I'd want to do it for better performance, but because it takes a while for that to happen, I'm just going to choose to allow the virtual disk files to grow. The next option is for networks. The one thing that we get before we actually get to networks is it is going to verify that there is enough disk space in the target location. If you don't have enough disk space, this actually will error out and will prevent you from actually starting this transfer. These transfers can take a really, really long period of time, and so you don't want them to error out at some point just because you ran out of disk space. We can add additional NICs in here if we want, up to 10. Maybe we only want 1, maybe we want 5, I don't know. Do we want to connect it to power on? How do we want our network to be configured? And then do we want to install the VMware VMware tools as part of the conversion? And also, do we want to customize the identity of the new virtual machine? What this allows me to do is just like we did before with that whole taking it out of the domain, putting it back in the domain, changing the SID and changing the name and all that stuff. This allows me to do all of this in one fell swoop. So let's talk about how we can do this customization of virtual machine identity. We can give it a new computer name, Nugget 4. We can give it an owner name. We'll call it me, and give it an organization, us. And we can also generate a new security ID. In order for us to do that generation of a new security ID, we actually have to have the Microsoft sysprep files available to us. And those are available on an operating system CD, whether it's a Windows 2003 operating system CD or an XP operating system CD. But those sysprep files are located in the support/tools location of those operating system CDs. I've actually extracted those files already out of the CD. It's in like I said, it was in the tools, the support tools folder, and brought them onto the desktop. Here you'll see there's a sysprep folder right here. In order to find those, click here for more information about those sysprep files. It'll tell you exactly what files you need to be able to pull out. There are two files, the setupcl file and the sysprep file. Now note that the sysprep files are different depending on the operating system you're trying to use. I said that it's available on all the operating system CDs, but if we're doing an XP sysprep, it's a different set of sysprep files than if we're doing a Windows Server 2003, etc., etc. So we click next here. If we have product ID information or licensing information for this version of Windows, we can enter it in here. I'm not going to go ahead and do that. We can leave it blank if it does not require, if it's a volume license, for example. If it is a server, in this case it's a workstation, but if it's a server, we can also choose the license mode, whether it's per seat or per server. One thing you'll notice here is that these selections are very similar to the selections that you get when you do a standard sysprep resealing. We click next again, and I can choose the time zone, I can choose the international date line, I can choose whatever time zone I want in here. I'll just choose the date line. I can choose also what I want for my network settings, if those network settings are bridged, if they use DHCP. I can even go as far as to actually configure the specific settings for DNS servers, for IP address servers, and WINS information for WINS primary and secondary, and also suffixes as well if I want. I'm not going to do that here at this point because I am using DHCP in this network, but if you're using statics, you will need to customize that to bring it in. Lastly, I can either add it to a work group, or I can even add it into a Windows Server domain. We can add it right into the nuggetlab.com domain and type in the administrator information and make sure you get the password right. And then click next. And then lastly, it's ready to complete. Once we click finish at this point, it will begin the conversion process of moving that physical machine over to this virtual machine. Now, we're not actually going to click the finish process here because the actual P2V process can take an excruciatingly long amount of time. On average, converting servers from physical to virtual can take anywhere from 2 hours to 5 hours to 6 to 8 hours sometimes, depending on the speed of the network, the speed of the source and destination system, the size of the disk file, and some other factors in there as well. A good average for the amount of time it could take is upwards of about 4 to 5 hours to complete this process. And I really don't feel like pausing the recording for 5 hours to let the process complete. So be aware that when you click this process, be aware that it's going to take a fairly long time for this process to complete, for it to actually move that instance from where it was into where you need it to be. So let me go ahead and click cancel here, and we're going to uninstall that VMware Converter Agent from the remote machine as we click cancel because we don't really want that VMware Converter Agent to be on the remote machine. Now, while we've talked about thus far is the process of importing in physical machines, there are two other mechanisms for importing in data as well, and that's importing from an existing VMware instance, like an ESX Server Virtual Center, or from a standalone virtual machine. The P2V process is not really a P2V process if you don't start with a P. You're actually starting with a V. So this is actually converting from other versions of VMware, whether it be ESX or Virtual Center or Workstation or even Microsoft at third-party backup images. It's a similar process, but it actually doesn't take quite as long, and it's a simpler process because you're not doing driver manipulations at this point. So this is the tool that you'll use inside of Workstation to do all of that anytime that you're actually doing any kind of conversions. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about deploying, manipulating, and converting our virtual machines. We talked about existing virtual machines and how those virtual machines are very portable, how we can import them into our workstation so that we can change around around some of the VM characteristics. We also talked about creating new virtual machines and connecting them to CD-ROM drives, and also how we can use the VMX files as a tool to manipulate configurations for those virtual machines. And lastly, we talked about that P2V process and how we can do lots of different types of conversions leveraging VMware Converter. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.